Hello and welcome to the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. It's Oscar here on day 10 of COP26, discussing UK leadership on decarbonising transport. I'm really pleased to be joined by Ben Nelmes. Ben is the head of policy and research at New Automotive and used to be the head of policy at UK SIF. New Automotive is an independent transport research organisation with a mission to accelerate and support the switch to electric vehicles in the UK.
Hello, it's James and Sally here to let you all know about our podcast sponsor.
This COP26 series of the UK SIF Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Lion Trust. We're delighted to have them involved. Lion Trust is a specialist fund management company that was founded in 1995.
And as of July 2021, they had £34 billion in assets under management. Their aim is to have a positive impact on their investors, stakeholders, and society.
We're so pleased to have them on board for this series. Without the support of our partners, the podcast would not be able to happen.
So, without further interruption, let's get on with the episode.
Let's get into it straight away, Ben. It would be lovely to hear about some of your current priorities at New Automotive, and where do you see the UK at this point in its ambitions to shift towards zero emissions transport? Thanks.
Sure thing. Yeah, it's great to be with you. So I think our priorities are mostly around how can we get as many drivers as possible to make the switch to an electric car in the UK. In the UK, transport's about 27% of all emissions, and cars are the vast majority of that. In fact, cars alone make up about 15% of the UK's emissions. So we often hear a lot about shipping and aviation when we talk about climate change and transport, but cars are a really big priority, and they're an area where there's a technology that's ready to replace the polluting technology. So the way we go about getting people into more cars is twofold, really. One is by trying to persuade consumers of the benefits of switching, and the other way is by using data to inform the development of public policy. So we have lots of consumer tools that people can use to find out how much they would save by switching to an electric car. And then we've also been working with the Department for Transport, helping them design the UK's forthcoming ZEV mandate. So in terms of where the UK is at the moment, I'd say we're at the sort of pretty much at the start of quite a big and long journey. I think there's some things that are going to happen quickly, and there's some things that will happen a bit more slowly. So I think the thing that will happen quickly is a change in the kinds of cars that are sold in the UK. Electric cars, fully electric cars, are about 1 in 10 of all new cars at the moment, and that number's risen a lot. But there's only 300,000 of them on the road out of 32 million cars. It's going to take an awful long time to replace all those cars. Cars hang around on the road for about 14 years, and there's about 2 million new cars entering the on-the-road fleet, if you like, every year. So it's quite a long way to go, but we've seen some good developments and good progress. We just need it to go faster.
That sounds great, Ben. And yeah, totally agree with you. We all need to move a bit further and faster on this agenda, particularly with transport constituting a huge portion of the UK's emissions. You mentioned the kind of need to go faster. We saw the publication recently of the UK government's net zero strategy, which was long awaited by many of us in financial services and other sectors. I mean, to what extent do you think the strategy really kind of delivers on the agenda of New Automotive? There's some interesting things in there. For instance, the zero emission vehicle mandate that you mentioned, and I think BEIS will be consulting on that from 2024, I understand. What promise does kind of that holds, and other policies coming out from the strategy?
Yeah, well, we've had the strategy we thought was really positive. There's been a flurry of things coming out of the Department for Transport and other government departments in the run up to COP. I think transport's been one big area. I mean, the Prime Minister's been talking about his priorities as coals, cars, cash, and trees. So it's good to see that cars are in there. But yeah, the big developments recently has been the fact that the UK's brought forward the date by which it will end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2040 to 2030. That was announced about a year ago. And then since then, we've had clarity about the future of grants and incentives for people who are buying electric cars. So we know that the plug-in car grant will carry on until 2022 and 23. And then, of course, the big one, which I think has kind of yet to hit home, really, the significance of what this is, but it's the zero emissions vehicle mandate. And this is a policy framework that was first developed in California back in the 1990s and has given rise to a really huge market for low emission and now zero emission vehicles in California. And in fact, when you look at the early days of Tesla, it was that policy framework that really enabled Tesla to turn a profit at all early on. And to this day, about 20% of Tesla's profits are accounted for by how they are rewarded by this policy framework. So it's a hugely impactful thing. Obviously, we've only had an announcement that the government are going to do it, and we don't know what it's going to look like. And that will become clearer over the course of the next year. And we'll be engaging with that and making it as practical and as ambitious as it can be.
Thanks very much, Ben. And yeah, I think that was one of the headline measures for transport, this new zero emissions vehicle mandate. And you say it sort of was pioneered in California. And also that actually the government is consulting on it, I think is the intention. But I suppose, how to what extent will this really kind of take the agenda forward? And I suppose separate to California, are there any kind of other successful models where this has worked, very well elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, so it's certainly not just California that's done it. China has a new I always forget what it's called. It's called something like the NEV mandate. This is a world of horrific acronyms, but they're certainly not a new idea. They've been around for quite a long time, and they're essentially a supplier obligation system, of which the UK has a few as well. And what they do is they establish a system of tradable obligations for car manufacturers. So if you're a manufacturer and you're selling, say, 100,000 units a year, it will the government will set you a target and say, suppose 15% of the new cars that you sell next year have to be zero emissions. If you meet that target, that's great. That's fine. That's the end of the story. If you fail to meet that target, then you're going to have to buy some credits off somebody else and to make up for the fact that you haven't met that target. And then if you've exceeded that target, you can sell those credits. So it creates this market for these credits. And essentially what it does is it means that car companies that are laggards, that are not producing a lot and selling a lot of zero emissions vehicles, start to have to subsidize their competitors. And of course, if you're a car company or if you're an investor in a car company, that's a pretty awful place to be. So it's potentially a really powerful tool for shifting behavior in the car industry. It should also, the fact that it's reallocating capital and money within the car industry means that it should start to address some of the market imbalances. We know, for example, that electric cars are more expensive than their petrol or diesel counterparts, but if you're only producing petrol cars and you're paying this regulatory premium, you're going to have to start to raise the prices of your units in order to meet that obligation. And then, of course, lastly, because it's a government mandated scheme and because the thresholds or the proportions of cars that are being sold that have to be zero emissions will change every year. They'll rise steadily up to 2030 when sales of new petrol and diesel cars will end. It actually sets a kind of a really good amount of clarity, sets out clarity for businesses and investors who are thinking, how's that market going to change? And also, if you're thinking, am I going to invest in in battery manufacturing or electric car assembly or EV charging, you know that the market for those products are going to be there. So it gives businesses and investors a huge amount of confidence. So it's a really, really positive framework as well. And of course, the last thing is the Treasury has been subsidizing electric car purchases with grants and fiscal incentives. These cost a lot of money, and the pandemic obviously has been hugely expensive for Rishi Sunak. He's not going to want to pay out much more. So this takes the burden away from the taxpayer, which is where it should go, and puts it on industry. and actually implements the polluter pays principle. So you have the producers of the most polluting cars subsidizing those who are producing the more clean ones. It's win-win in my view.
That's really great to hear, Ben. And we've kind of talked a lot about the positives coming out of the strategy, particularly with this new mandate. I suppose, are there any things that are kind of missing from the strategy that you kind of wish to see, and that would perhaps provide, as you say, a bit more investor and business certainty to invest in these new technologies? You know, was there sufficient funding that we saw for EV charging infrastructure, for example, or anything else that you thought was kind of missing from the strategy, or did it tick all the boxes? Do we think?
So yeah, I think it ticked a lot of boxes, but I would say, yeah, on the question of infrastructure, that's probably an area where I think the government could go a bit further and a bit faster. One of the most common complaints about electric cars is that the public charging infrastructure is a little bit rickety and patchy. So we've got problems of lack of coverage in some places, and also problems around reliability. And that's because the business models of charging installers has been around installing the chargers in return for public subsidy, and not actually getting revenue from people using the chargers. So they're sort of putting them there and waiting for a market to come along. I think we need to see a little bit of reform around the obligations on charge point providers. So one of those might be an obligation to make sure that a certain number of chargers are in use and operational, and if they go out of order, they get repaired quickly. I also think the government should look to bring local authorities into the process of rolling out chargers much more centrally. The government's considering giving local authorities a statutory duty to make sure that there is charge point coverage in certain areas, and I think in their local area rather. And I think that's probably a good idea, and it's a place we should end up going, because you want to make sure that chargers are not just put in the places that are going to switch to electric cars first, but you want to make sure that there is equality of access to charge points, so that this transition doesn't become beset by some of the issues that we sometimes see, where these transitions happen, some areas and some communities get left behind. So yeah, charging infrastructure, I think, is somewhere where we could see the government go a bit further. But on the other side of things, on the regulating the market and the fiscal incentives, I think the government's doing a pretty good job.
That's good to hear. So overall, a pretty positive scorecard, it sounds like, Ben, in that case. I think if it's okay with you, we'd better turn to COP26. Obviously, we're speaking during the week of COP. And yes, we're talking on day 10 on Transport Day. And it'd be great to get your thoughts, Ben, on what do you think would be some of the positive outcomes coming out of the summit in delivering on net zero emissions transport, and what realistically could policymakers at COP drive forward here?
Yeah, so I think COP is really positive for the transition to electric cars. You've got governments and you've got car manufacturers. They're coming to COP, each of them bringing forward their own commitments and pledges, and some of them are really ambitious, and that's great. I think what we want to see is more governments matching what the UK is doing here. So the first thing I think that governments should do, if they haven't already done it, is set a date when they are going to end the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles. And of course, that date will be slightly different depending on each country's market. Then the second thing is introduce a policy framework to encourage and enable consumers to access the benefits of switching to electric vehicles. So that might be incentives and grants like we have in the UK. It might be supplier obligations like the UK is moving towards. And then I think the last thing is to electrify. So the charging infrastructure, as we know, is going to be vital to this. The UK is in quite a fortunate position because we have lots of parts of the country that have spare electricity capacity, and we have huge renewable electricity generation potential in the UK. It's a very windy place, and also the solar farms actually do quite well here as well these days. So we've got lots of electricity, so that's not really a problem for us. But in other parts of the world, electricity generation capacity really, really needs to expand quite rapidly, and that's to support charging infrastructure. So that's the last thing. It's just a lot of attention needs to be put on the infrastructure in other parts of the world. And then lastly, I think I would just say a kind of gentle reminder to everyone, which is that, as I said at the beginning, when we talk about transport emissions, people often talk about aviation, they talk about shipping, they talk about freight. These are all really important, or they talk about active travel and walking, cycling, public transport. They are no doubt very, very important areas. However, they are also some of the most difficult and complex areas where you can focus on to try and reduce transport emissions. Electric cars are a bit of a no-brainer for reducing the vast majority of transport emissions, and so I would say don't forget about electric cars to everybody at COP.
You've teed me up very nicely, Ben, for my next question on some of the challenges ahead that we face post COP for policymakers, particularly when it comes to aviation and shipping and their contribution to emissions. Do you think these areas need to be scrutinised a little bit further by governments, and perhaps in the net zero strategy, was there a lack of mention of these two areas in that strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, aviation and shipping have always lagged behind. They weren't initially covered by, they haven't been covered by global agreements for as long as territorial transport emissions have. So that's the emissions from cars driving around inside the UK, clearly with the responsibility of the UK government. But shipping, it's the ultimate offshore industry. It's not been very well regulated in terms of its emissions. The same is true of aviation, international aviation. And so, so one thing is to improve those agreements, and that's really, really important. And then, of course, they're both, particularly in terms of aviation, they're both difficult because the technology is not yet there. And so I think the big priority for those areas, it must be to invest more in the technologies that are going to enable us to reduce emissions. But in the meantime, I think the big challenge for the easier areas where there are technological solutions like electric cars is just, how do you get the investment in the infrastructure that's necessary? How do you get the investment in the manufacturing? How do you transition supply chains and support businesses to end producing petrol and diesel cars and switch over to batteries? And I think that's where it comes down to, again, policy and having those really clear long-term policy frameworks that provide a signal that allow businesses and investors to start switching what they're doing.
Absolutely agree, Ben, and that's something that we hear from our members. Every day is having that policy certainty to allow members to price in some of these transition risks as they look to invest in these new areas. We're coming towards the end of our discussion, I think, today. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Ben, but I suppose it would be good to hear your thoughts on, any messages that you have for our audience, which will be many UK CIF members. Any key takeaways for the finance sector and investors on the role that they should play in this area and driving us towards a better future?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, finance plays an absolutely crucial role in the transition to electric cars and sustainable transport. As you all know, and everyone listening knows, finance plays a really important but often misunderstood role in the transition to sustainable everything. So transport is no exception. Finance, then the role of finance in the UK car industry is multi-faceted. So you've got the big investments in companies who produce cars. You've also got the very long-term investments in the charging infrastructure. And then, of course, you've got the car finance providers as well. So people, most people who buy a new car, they don't actually own it themselves. They're getting it on a lease hire plan, on a personal contract purchase, and all of these sorts of agreements. And there's a big question about how those consumer finance products treat electric cars compared with how they treat internal combustion engine cars. We hear lots of questions about the stability of the second-hand price of electric cars and what the residual value of an electric car is going to be over its lifetime. I think there's equal uncertainty, although it's much less often discussed, around the residual value of new petrol and diesel cars entering the market now, when they're going to be towards the end of their life. They're going to be around in a world where significantly fewer of the cars on the road will be petrol and diesel. And then also, what's the future demand for electric cars as well? Are people who buy cars, are they going to be prepared to make that switch? I think I would say two things to UCSIF members and to the finance sector in general. One is pay close attention to developments in public policy. There are some quite, things like the ZEV mandate, they are technical and they are a little bit difficult, but they are really important because they do reduce risk in some areas, and they are going to push up costs in other areas. So, if you're investing in car companies, ask yourself, how are they transitioning? Is that plan in line with the UK government's forthcoming ZEV mandate? So listen to Oscar's policy updates and briefings for updates on that. I'm sure he'll be all over the detail. And then the other thing is we need to see some innovation, I think, in some of the consumer finance products that are offered. The economics of switching from a petrol car to a petrol car are very different to the economics of switching from a petrol car to an electric car. Electric cars, as I think I said earlier, are a little bit more expensive upfront, but they come with much lower running costs and they might last quite a lot longer. In fact, the initial data from the oldest electric cars suggests that they keep going for quite a long time. So that's quite a different model to petrol cars. And so I think, we could look at, I think the market is ripe for some innovation around products that take into account the fuel cost savings and the long-term fuel cost savings of buying an electric car, and using that to reduce the risk of the greater capital outlay and the bigger loan that you're going to have to make to help a consumer access a car with a higher sticker price. So I think there's room for a little bit of innovation there. And I'm sure there's room for innovation, across the whole of this industry. This is in many ways a new market, and they're going to need some new approaches. So pay attention to the policy and look at the data, and also innovate. Those are my messages.
Thanks very much, Ben. Some really good takeaways for our members, and obviously particularly appreciate the pointer to look out on policy risks and the implications for that for our members. That's really good to hear. I think that brings us to the end of our conversation today. Thanks so much, Ben, for joining us. It's been a really excellent discussion and we've covered a lot of ground. For our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe and tune into our other episodes coming out throughout COP26 in Glasgow. You can find us on Twitter @UKCIV. That's all one word. Speak very soon. Thanks.